So in Screencast 2, we're going to look at who the main facility providers are, and we're also going to look at the range of what they provide. Now, I think it's worth saying at the outset that the picture for the provision of sport is complex, it's involved, and it can be difficult to understand. So my approach in this screencast is that I'm taking a broad overview, and this broad overview requires a level of simplification. Now, the simplification hopefully means, if I do it properly, that it will make it more understandable for you and it won't be too confusing. And at this stage in your academic career, as first year undergraduate students, I don't want to confuse you. I want to give you a sound understanding of the fundamentals, and the kind of niceties and complexities are things that you can develop as you progress with your studies. And there will be opportunities for you to develop your knowledge and understanding of some of the complexities associated with facility management provision as you go through your academic career at Sheffield Hallam University. So, the kind of slightly simplistic but useful model that I'm going to use to help explain the mix of providers that we have is that we have what's called a mixed economy of provision. And what this means is that sports facility providers operate in three sectors: the commercial or private sector, and you'll hear those two terms used, and they are used interchangeably. Okay, so we're going to look at what the commercial sector generally provides. And remember, we're simplifying this, so we're not going to talk about every single kind of example. We're going to talk about the things that they most commonly provide. And we're going to talk about them particularly in terms of the sport and physical activity environment. And I'm probably going to focus particularly at the kind of participation and talk less about professional sports, certainly, and professional sports stadia, because they tend to operate in different ways than more kind of community-based facilities, which can also double as venues for elite sport. Okay, so we're going to talk about the commercial or the private sector. We're going to talk about the public or the government sector. So you'll hear public sector used quite a lot. And what that generally means is government, and particularly in sports facility provision, when we talk about government, really, we're talking about local government. In England, in the UK, central government does not really get involved and doesn't have much of a role in the direct provision of sports facilities. This is done through local government or local councils. So when I talk about local government or local authorities in this lecture, I'm talking about local councils. Okay. And finally, I'm going to talk about the voluntary or the third sector. In this lecture, when I talk about the voluntary or the third sector, I'm going to talk about sports clubs primarily. Now, this can get rather confusing, this voluntary or third sector, because sometimes the voluntary sector is called the voluntary and community sector. And the community sector can involve charitable trusts. And a lot of charitable trusts have been set up to manage and operate sports facilities. And I will explain this with examples from Sheffield more in this lecture, in this screencast. But really there's an overlap between public and community and third sector trusts, because really a lot of them have been set up in partnership with local councils in order to manage sports facilities. But really, initially, when I talk about voluntary or third sector in this lecture, I'm talking about club sport. So provision which is provided by local rugby clubs, local tennis clubs, local cricket clubs, local golf clubs. Okay, so I'm talking about that kind of provision. Okay, so let's start with the commercial or private sector. And as I've said, this is going to be pitched at a fairly high level. So I'm not going to get down into lots of detail. This is a broad overview. So the commercial sector, what is it about? The ultimate goal and the ultimate objective of providing sports facilities and physical activity facilities by the commercial or the private sector is that there needs to be a focus on profit. There has to be a return on capital employed, to use a financial term. That means if investors are putting money into private facilities to build them and to manage them, if owners are putting their own money into private facilities to build them and to manage them, they want to see a return on the money that they put in, and that return is profit. So they want to see more money coming back to them than they put into this. Okay. Now, the commercial sector provides a fairly broad range of things, but the most common form of provision is gyms and health and fitness clubs. And these are often, although not always, provided through the vehicle of large chains. So chains which operate across the country and sometimes internationally. And in this country, we've got, for example, Pure Gym, The Gym, at the budget end of the market. Okay, so these are kind of cheap, relatively affordable gyms, and well, they are just gyms. And then you've got larger health clubs, which are gyms and swimming pools, and in the case of David Lloyd, for example, venues for tennis and racket sports as well. So we've got clubs like Virgin Active and David Lloyd. Okay. Now, you might sit down and think about what other kinds of sports facilities are provided by the commercial sector. I would say that the dominant form is health and fitness clubs. But in Sheffield, for example, we have got some facilities which are operated commercially. So Goals Soccer is a kind of football centre which is managed commercially. Some of you might be thinking, well, what about golf clubs and tennis clubs? Surely they're private. I would argue that they belong in the voluntary sector, because they are run by kind of boards of trustees who are made up of members. So they are run by members for the benefit of members. So they're a kind of mutually beneficial voluntary organisation, and they're not about making profit to be paid to an owner or to shareholders. The money that they might make would be put back into maintaining their facilities and improving their facilities. So I would argue that golf courses, tennis clubs, which you join as a member, they are more likely, in my view, to belong in the voluntary sector. Okay, so if we've said that the main role or the main provision of facilities through the commercial sector is health and fitness clubs, I want to give a bit of an overview of the scale and the size of provision of that particular market. And my source for using this is Mintel academic reports. Now, these are available to you as students at Sheffield Hallam University. And if you go to the SHU Library Gateway, and on the kind of landing page, on the home page of the Library Gateway, you need to look for a link for A to Z of databases. If you click on the link of A to Z databases, you'll see an alphabetical list which you can click on, and clearly you will find Mintel under M. Apologies if I'm speaking down to you now, okay? I don't intend to. Now, within Mintel, you will then be able to search for one of the reports which I'm going to talk to you about today, which is health and fitness clubs, which is hot off the press. It's only recently been published in September 2020. So this gives us really good up-to-date information on what's going on in the health and fitness club market. So one of the things when we look at the scale and the size of the scope is the total value. So the amount of revenue which is generated by the health and fitness industry as represented by private clubs. We're going to look separately at the size, the economic size, the financial size of the leisure facility market, which is primarily provided through local authorities in the public sector. So when we talk about this market, we're talking about facilities which are provided by those commercial sports facilities. And what we can see if we look at this is that this market has been growing. So between 2015 and 2019, it grew from a value of 2.8 billion, right? So these figures are in millions of pounds. So 2,815 million is actually 2.8 billion, okay? Because a billion is 1,000 million. So we can see it grew from 2.8 billion to 3.3 billion. Right? And if we correct up, it's 3.4 billion. So what we can see is very significant annual growth rates in the amount of money which these facilities are generating. Now, this is the size of the kind of health and fitness economy, if you like. To contrast this against the UK economy, the UK economy is growing by around about 1 to 1.5% in most of these years. So what we can see is that the growth of the health and fitness economy and the money which is generated in that economy, which is an indicator of the size of the market, that was growing much faster than the economy in general. But what we can see in 2020, no surprise, is that because of coronavirus or COVID-19 and the drastic impact that's had on sports facilities in general and health and fitness clubs I would include in this, then this market and revenue in this market is expected to drop by 55%. And this is because health and fitness clubs have had to suspend direct debits, right? So most members of health and fitness clubs pay membership fees on a monthly basis by direct debits from their banks, and these have been suspended while facilities are closed. And what we can see is that the industry, according to Mintel, is forecast to recover, but really it's going to take a good, so if we look at, from now, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years to catch up and overtake with the value it had achieved in 2019. So this sector has taken a big hit, and it's going to take, Mintel reckons, 4 years for the health and fitness market to actually recover. Okay, and many economic forecasters are going to say that it's going to take us at least as long that for the UK economy in general to recover following COVID-19. Okay, but that gives you some idea of the figures. So the last normal year that we had, normal year in inverted commas, the value of the health and fitness market was £3.3 billion. Okay, now, so how extensive is this kind of membership? Well, what Mintel say, and this is based on a survey of 2,000 people, which is randomly sampled. I don't know if you've done this in research methods yet, but a 2,000 sample, as long as it is kind of well constructed, is good enough to give us an accurate representation of the prevalence of gym membership in the population as a whole. So what Mintel is telling us is that based on their sample survey, 23% of the population said that they were current members of a health and fitness club. So 23% is quite high. And it's also interesting that if you look at kind of levels of physical activity participation rates, as measured by surveys like the Active Lives survey, that, this leads us to wonder how often are some of these people actually visiting their health and fitness clubs, because they might be members, but that doesn't mean they're active. And I would expect that if 23% of people were members of health and fitness clubs and were active members in terms of using their membership and visiting regularly, then this would have a big impact on physical activity participation rates. The fact is that a lot of people have memberships, but there's plenty of data from the industry which shows that they do not frequently make use of their memberships. And I've seen data which shows that figures that, almost 50 or 60% of users who are members of health and fitness clubs have not used their gym in the last 3 to 4 months. Okay, and some will only use it once or twice a year. Okay, and this leads us on to the second figure, which is that 20% of a further 20% of the population say that they have been a member of a health and fitness club in the past, but their membership has lapsed. They haven't renewed. And this is a big issue in the industry generally, that memberships suffer what's called a high attrition rate. And that is to say that almost 50% of people who are members of a gym, whether it's a public gym or a private gym, in a 12-month period, they are likely to let their membership lapse. So after 12 months, they will leave and they will not renew their gym membership. And a further 57% of the population say that they have never been a member of a gym. So who are some of the biggest providers then? Well, what we've got here is we've got a graph or a chart which segments the kind of the health club market into low-cost operators, so Pure Gym and the Gym Group, mid-market, so typically these facilities are charging £30 to £40 a month for their membership, and these include chains like Anytime Fitness, and did include DW Fitness. So DW Fitness, these are the same people that used to own kind of Wigan Football Club, so Dave Whelan, and used to own JJB kind of sports clothing and retail shops. So DW Fitness grew out of that empire. It doesn't exist anymore. It's being bought up by somebody else, but that's another example. And then at the top end, you've got Nuffield Health Clubs. So Nuffield has expanded into the health and fitness market from the broader health market. So Nuffield Health obviously operate private health facilities, hospitals, clinics, and so on. And then David Lloyd Leisure, which has grown out of a kind of hotel-based business. So this leads us to another kind of thing, is that, the sports market in the commercial sector quite often sees entrants coming from outside of sports. So at the premium end here, we've got David Lloyd Leisure, which used to be owned by Whitbreads, and Whitbreads used to own pubs, and now they own hotels and restaurants. So they're coming from other industries into the sports sector. Nuffield Health has expanded from the health field into the sports field. But I'm digressing slightly here, and what I need to say is that this shows us the relative scale. So the purple bar shows us the number of facilities, the number of sites. The green bar shows us the number of members, and the gold bar shows us the revenue that they generate. So what we can see is that Pure Gym is the largest operator in terms of the number of facilities, followed by the Gym Group. Okay, so the budget sector have got more sites than anybody else. Okay, and they've also got more members. So they've grown very, very fast. Really, in the last decade, slightly more than a decade, they've grown to dominate. And what they've done is they've taken the Ryanair model of a kind of no frills service and they've applied it to the health and fitness market. What has happened is that really the low cost operators have squeezed out some of the mid market operators. Right? So they've undercut their price and they've really squeezed them out. And that's one reason that DW Fitness, as I've mentioned, has kind of struggled and is kind of out of the market at the minute because it is losing ground to the low cost operators. And what we can see is that the premium clubs are fairly large and they've got a modest number of members. Their revenue is very high. And their revenue is very high because they charge a high membership fee in direct contrast to the low cost operators. So Pure Gym, for example, you could get a membership for £10 a month. Nuffield or David Lloyd, you're talking about £60 per month upwards in all likelihood. So this generates very high levels of revenue. This doesn't necessarily mean they're highly profitable because some of these facilities are more expensive to operate than the budget gym facilities. We haven't got time in this lecture to talk about why that is, but that gives you some sense of the size and the scope. So I want to move on to now and talk about the public or government sector. And the focus here is quite different than the commercial sector. Historically, local government, and it's local government, local councils, who we're really talking most about here when we talk about public or government sector. We do also include schools and colleges, but provision originally in the public sector, if you looked at any history on this, was to improve the kind of health and well-being of the population by giving them kind of clean places to actually wash and keep themselves clean. And going back to the 19th century, the Public Baths and Wash Houses Act, which was an act of Parliament in England, allowed local authorities to build private baths and wash houses, which were literally places where people could go to have a wash and to keep clean, and swimming pools were often built as onto these facilities as somewhere for people to also actually, exercise and be active. Now, the focus has changed over the years, but going back to the Victorian period in the Industrial Revolution, the focus was to avoid diseases like cholera and typhoid, of which there were outbreaks, and there's a cholera monument in Sheffield to a major outbreak in Sheffield in the mid-19th century. So a lot of provision in the government sector has always been about health and improving the kind of, in Victorian terms, the moral condition of the population. We might use slightly different language these days. We might say it's about improving health, reducing crime and antisocial behaviour, increasing social networks and social capital, and regenerating economically and physically the look of our cities and towns. And Sheffield is a city which has used sports facilities to try to regenerate former industrial areas out in the east end of the city. So the English Institute of Sport, ICE Sheffield, and Sheffield Arena were all built to try to improve what was a derelict industrial area which occurred as the steel industry collapsed in the 1980s in Sheffield. Okay, so the main provision that I'm going to talk about is local government and local councils, and there is very significant provision through schools, colleges and universities as well. Okay, What I will say is that they provide a wider range of sports facilities than the commercial sector. So they provide leisure centres, swimming pools, gyms, grass and artificial grass pitches, golf courses, parks, so informal spaces and athletics tracks, to name a few. There are many, many more than that. I won't list all of those out. And councils may manage these facilities themselves, or they may enter into agreements with other organisations to manage them on their behalf. And this is called outsourcing. And this is where understanding local authority or council sport gets confusing, because there are lots of organisations out there managing facilities on behalf of councils, but ultimately the facilities belong to the councils and are provided by the councils, but through quite often a separate organisation who manages on their behalf. So this is a complicated picture, but councils have tended to outsource the management of their facilities as a result of, first of all, government policy, which has encouraged them to try to manage things more economically and more efficiently, but also council spending really for the last 30, 40 years has overall seen a reduction, and the amount of money that councils have to spend on services has been under constant pressure in recent years in particular. So councils also try to look at other organisations who may be able to manage their facilities more economically, i.e. at a lower cost, or more efficiently, i.e. by generating more visits whilst keeping costs down to generate more revenue, which is quite often shared between the organisation that manages the facility on behalf of the council and the council themselves. Okay, this is very complicated and is the subject of a lecture by itself, so I'm not going to talk about that in any more detail. What I am going to say is, if you look at a city in Sheffield, there is quite a fragmented structure for facility management of public sector facilities. So in Sheffield, Sheffield City Trust manages most public sports facilities on behalf of the council, and this includes Ponds Forge, Hillsborough Leisure Centre, and it involves other smaller local sports facilities like Healy Swimming Pool, Westfield Sports Centre, Springs Sports Centre. So it manages a number of those sports centres, and it also manages golf course. As well as that, it also manages Sheffield City Hall, the concert venue, and where you will graduate as graduates of Sheffield Hallam University. And it also manages Sheffield Arena, so the major events and conference venue out in the Don Valley. Now, Sheffield City Trust is a charitable trust with charitable objectives. So it is a non-profit organisation, and really it is an arm's length organisation for the council. So ultimately, it is a public facility, a public facility operator. It is not commercial. It does not try to aim to make a profit. Any profit it did make, and by the way, it never really makes a profit, it invests back into facilities in Sheffield. It doesn't provide profits in the forms of dividends to shareholders or income to private owners. That does not happen. Okay, so it is a non-profit organisation. Also within Sheffield, there are two smaller charitable trusts. There are three smaller charitable trusts. I've just realised a mistake on this slide. And they are Zest and King Edward Swimming Pool, who manage two smaller swimming pools, and Stocksbridge Leisure Centre Trust, and this is why there are three charitable trusts in Sheffield, manage a large centre in Stocksbridge. But these are standalone, not-for-profit community trusts who manage a single facility. They're not like Sheffield City Trust, who manage a large number of facilities in Sheffield. They manage a single facility. And these facilities are managed in this way because otherwise there was a likelihood that they would have been closed down. So one of the advantages of managing a facility through the vehicle of a charitable trust is that charitable trusts are exempt from certain kinds of taxation. So that keeps the cost of facility management down. And they are also able to borrow and raise money to invest in facilities in a way that local councils are not allowed to. So local councils are not allowed to borrow money on what are called capital markets, and certain sources of funding are not available to them, but charitable trusts are able to attract funding and borrowing to invest in facilities in different ways than local councils are. And then finally, within Sheffield, we have an organisation called Places Leisure, and this manages Graves Health and Sports Centre and Thorncliffe Health and Sports Centre. So Graves Health and Sports Centre is in the south of the city, and Thorncliffe Health and Sports Centre is in the north of the city. And Places Leisure is part of Places for People, which is a specialist facility management company which manages and builds schools, hospitals, health clinics, a wide variety of different kinds of things. So this is a kind of commercial company. So it operates commercially, but it manages facilities on behalf of councils through a contract. And the contract that councils use to let Graves and Thorncliffe out to Places and People to manage will specify certain conditions that must be met in order to serve the public of Sheffield, so that they are not pure profit-making organisations, they are hybrid organisations. I don't want to get into any more detail than that. You just need to be aware that it's a complicated picture. Okay. So what are some of the characteristics of public sector facility management? Well, I think one of the most important points to make, and we'll come back to this in Screencast 3, is that local government sport is a discretionary, non-statutory service. What does this mean? Non-statutory means that there is no legal obligation on Sheffield City Council or any council to provide any sports facilities or services whatsoever. And that is one reason why there are wide variations between the level of provision. And you might look at your hierarchy for your local town and city and think, well, mine doesn't look anything like Sheffield's. And one of the reasons for that could be that because this service is discretionary and not regulated, there are no standards. There's no minimum standard, there's no maximum standard. So a council can spend as much or as little as it likes on sports services, and it can spend as much as it can afford in terms of its budget. Now, this brings us on to another point. If there is no legal requirement to provide sports facilities, this makes those facilities susceptible to budget cuts when central government is looking to make cuts in funding that it makes available to local councils. So it makes them susceptible to budget cuts, low prioritisation and outsourcing. So we've seen that the council has outsourced facilities in order to have them managed more effectively and, to be honest, more cheaply. Okay, so it's a money-saving exercise. So discretionary non-statutory service is important to understand. Discretionary means it's at individual council's discretion what they provide. Okay. One of the other things about public sector facility management, and this is where sports facilities are different than most other public sector services. So if you think about libraries and museums, usually they're offered by local councils, but they don't really charge admission fees for most things, right? Sports facilities generate income by charging admission fees and by catering and vending on site and by facility hire for events and competitions. And this can protect facilities from the problems outlined above. that they're non-statutory, that they're discretionary. Well, they can offset this by trying to raise more money through acting more commercially and charging higher prices and operating more efficiently. But this is the third point. This can also create a tension between the need to maximise income, so acting like a private sector operator in a way, while at the same time meeting social objectives, which might not be profitable. So some sport development activity and physical activity programs which happen within sports centres might not be profitable for leisure centre managers to organise. They might be better putting on aerobics classes in sports halls where they can pack in, many people, pay more money and generate more revenue. Yeah, so this can cause a tension. And public sports facilities also compete in a market with commercial and voluntary facilities for customers. And this means that they've always had to be managed to a degree as though they were businesses. They've always had income targets to meet. They've always had budgets to meet. The fact is that since 2010, central government has been following a policy of austerity. And what austerity means is that there has been, we'll talk about this a little bit more in more detail in the next screencast. This means that there's been a cut in government funding to local government, to councils. So councils have had to look to kind of make savings. One way they can try to make savings is by trying to reduce the amount of money that they spend on their leisure services, their sports centres. So sports centres traditionally, or quite often, have required a subsidy in order to operate. A subsidy means they have not operated at a profit. They've required money from councils to enable them to operate in order to meet social objectives, sport development objectives, physical activity objectives, quite often, to make sure that there is fair and open access for all people in society. Now, this austerity policy, which has happened since 2010, has accentuated these issues 1 to 5 that we talked about over the previous couple of slides. And what it's meant is that they've been subject to cuts. They've had to look at how they can avoid the possibility of closing facilities, which has meant they've had to generate more revenue because it's difficult to cut costs in facility management. And I'll explain why in the next screencast. So they've had to try to act more commercially and generate more revenue. And this has caused tension sometimes between sport development objectives and physical activity objectives, where those sport development and physical activity objectives have not really contributed towards commercial activity and income generation. So let's just look at some kind of data. This is another set of data from Mintel, and it looks at, this time, leisure centres and swimming pools in the public sector. And this too was published in September 2020. Well, what can we see? We can see that revenue, so the market value, it's lower than the health and fitness club sector in the commercial sector, but it's at around the 1.6, 1.5 billion pound mark. And what we can see is this has taken a similar hit in 2020 as a result of COVID-19 and is due to recover slowly. But what we'll see is it's not due to recover to the same levels as the kind of pre-COVID era. So what are some of the reasons behind that? Well, we'll explore that in Screencast 3. Now, how many people visit or use public sector leisure centres? Now, let's bear in mind that 23% of the population said that they were members of private health and fitness clubs. So 23% of people said they're members of private health and fitness clubs. 33% of people who Mintel surveyed as part of their information report, which they produced, said they'd visited a leisure centre or swimming pool in the last 12 months, a public leisure centre or swimming pool. So a third of the population have actually used a facility. So that is some argument to say that the public sector, although it doesn't generate as much revenue because it charges lower prices and it doesn't have the same membership model where people are paying whether they use the facility or not, that if we look at the proportion of people using the public sector, I would argue, based on this evidence and based on Mintel's evidence, is more significant than the private sector. So in terms of physical activity, sport development, participation in general, getting people moving, getting people active, public leisure centres are more significant than the commercial sector. And we can also see the breakdown here that, females are slightly more likely to use facilities than males, and that younger age groups are more likely than older age groups to have used public facilities in the previous 12 months. What are the most, let's just look at, so what I want to get across here is that although we've said that 23% of people say they are members of health and fitness clubs, a lot of those people aren't actually visiting and using. And this bears this out. So this is data not from 2020. It's a couple of years old, but it compares 2017 and 2018. And what we can see is that, visits to a public centre or leisure centre in the previous 12 months are hovering around the 30% mark, compared to visited a private health and fitness club around the 15% mark. So in other words, twice as many people use a public leisure centre as use a commercial leisure centre, despite the difference in economic value. Yeah, so we saw that, the public sector economic value or market value is 1.6 billion. And if you think back to the slides on the commercial sector health and fitness club market, it was around 3.3 billion. So twice as much revenue in the commercial sector, but half as much usage based on this evidence and these figures. Right? Okay. So what this suggests is that in terms of settings for sport, that leisure centres and swimming pools are more significant than going out for a run or cycle outdoor. They're a very significant setting for doing health and fitness activity. Another issue in use of public facilities versus private facilities is how equitable distribution is of use across social classes. Now, if you don't know what social class is, hopefully you will pick this up as you go through your studies here. But social class A and B are generally the high earners, the higher income earners. C1 and C2 are lower or middle income earners. D and E are kind of semi-skilled and unskilled workers who generally earn lower wages. And what we can see here is if we look at this, this shows us the percentage of people visiting a public leisure centre and swimming pool, and this is shown in purple, and in green we've got the percentage of people in each socioeconomic class visiting a private health and fitness club. And what we can see is that in the lower socioeconomic groups, people in socioeconomic group D are 3 times more likely to use a public sports facility than a private sports facility, and it's 2.5 times for E. E does include students as well, so students may be skewing some of these figures slightly. But what we can see is that for every socioeconomic class, public facilities are more important than private facilities. But the rationale for keeping public sector facilities cheap, and the reason they quite often don't make a profit or haven't made a profit in the past is to allow better access to sports facilities. And what we can see is that this policy has been effective, despite what some academics have written in some books over the years, I must say. This evidence is fairly clear to me that the justification for public sport facilities is clear in that people on lower incomes are far, far more likely to use them than they are to use commercial sector facilities. And that if we look at the higher earning groups, then the difference is far less. Okay. The argument against public sector facilities quite often is that some of these A and B people are using public sector facilities and they could afford to pay the higher costs of private facilities. So why are we subsidising the use of these affluent people as well? Okay. A leisure centre manager would say, if I didn't have these people coming in and generating revenue, I wouldn't be able to afford to operate the facility to provide for these people on lower incomes. So there's a debate to be had there. This shows us as well the most popular leisure activities. So swimming is still, swimming with family and friends and swimming on my own, if you take those together, swimming is still the most popular activity. It's also the most expensive to run for these facilities. So swimming pools are expensive to build, expensive to heat and light and maintain, and they are expensive to staff as well with lifeguarding. And that's why budget gyms in the commercial sector don't have swimming pools, because it enables them to cut costs. And in the private sector, the reason they have swimming pools is they actually rely on a fairly large number of people who are members who don't actually use the facilities, but who are contributing to the cost of running those swimming pools anyway. So swimming pools are very important, but for the economics of public sector swimming pools, that generates a problem because it's very difficult to have low prices available to encourage participation, whilst at the same time generating enough revenue and enough usage to actually mean that you don't require a subsidy, that you don't make a loss. Gym and fitness has been a really big growth area for public sector operators over the last 20 years. And it's a way for them to sell memberships and generate revenue, which allows them to subsidise or cross-subsidise non-profit making activities like swimming. Okay. So I said in Sheffield that leisure trusts operate all the public leisure facilities in Sheffield. And what we can see is this is measured to a degree nationally, and this is data taken from April 2017. And what we can see is that the purple part of this ring represents trusts. They manage most facilities, followed by education, so dual use sites where there is community use of sports facilities on school sites represents the second largest. In-house is where the council still manages its facilities. So I've worked in 2 local authorities in facility management. I've worked at Sheffield City Council, where now we have no facilities which are managed in-house. And I've also worked in Nottingham, for Nottingham City Council, where all facilities are managed in-house. Okay, so, and then we've got kind of other, so that's community organisations and sports groups. So King Edward Swimming Pool Community, Zest Community Trust, Chapeltown Community Trust, and then we've got leisure management contractor like Leisure Places, who manage Graves and Thorncliffe in Sheffield. Okay, and this slide really talks about who some of the main kind of providers are, but I'm not going to talk to you about that. I'm going to move on now to the voluntary sector and just discuss that. So voluntary sector sport is really not concerned with making a profit. It is less concerned with crime reduction traditionally, physical health. Those are not its primary goals. It is concerned with sport for sport's sake. So that's like-minded people getting together for mutually beneficial opportunities to play sport. The other thing I would say, and I'm going to justify this statement in a minute, is that overall, in the grand scheme of things, sports clubs are not major providers of facilities. They are tenants or hirers of facilities provided by other organisations. And an analysis of this follows on subsequent slides. And this is based on a survey which was conducted primarily by the Sport and Recreation Alliance. And the Sport and Recreation Alliance is an alliance which represents voluntary sector sport. And this is based on a sample of 1,600 sports clubs across England. So what this shows is club activities mainly take place in a hired facility or a leased place, and the minority take place in a facility owned by the club, right? And where facilities are leased, hired or borrowed, this is from the local authority and schools, and the minority are from kind of a private operator, shared with another club or borrowed from another club, a university or a charity. So what does this mean? This means that sports clubs are heavily reliant on public sector facilities. And this is going to be significant when we come into the next screencast and talk about issues affecting local authority sport. If local authority sport is changing the way it needs to operate because it is needing to make more money and generate more money, then this can have an impact on the rents it charges and the rates, the facility hire rates it lets out its facilities to for sports clubs. It can't afford to subsidise sports clubs any longer. It may need to generate more revenue. So this report says, and it is hyperlinked on this slide if you want to follow it. In total, over 2/3 of clubs, 69%, use facilities that belong to the public sector, right? And this demonstrates the reliance of sports clubs on public sector bodies to help them deliver their activity. Given the pressure on public sector finances, which we've mentioned and which we'll examine in more detail in the next screencast, this leaves the club sector very exposed. Okay. I want to finish off this screencast, which I know has been fairly long, with an analysis of facility provision in England by ownership type. So I want to look at some selected types of sports facility and see who provides it. I'm going to move through this fairly rapidly, and I'm going to ask you to draw some of your own conclusions. So this looks at swimming pools, and this is drawn from a database called Active Places Power, which is maintained by Sport England, and the data is collected by an organisation called the Leisure Database Company. So this uses Active Places Power data. And what this shows us is that the majority of swimming pools are provided in the public sector. So if we add together local authority and education, and most education pools will be not private schools and not universities, they will be state schools, they will be built by local authorities on school sites, and they will have significant community use. We can see that the majority of education, of provision is in the public sector. I would also say that you get a wider range of activity in local authority and education pools, and this is evidenced by the fact that, diving pools are almost exclusively located in local authority pools. So this means you're more likely to cater for a full range of aquatic disciplines. Yeah, so water polo, synchro, club swimming, learn to swim programs, school swimming. You're going to get more of that, I would argue, than you are going to get in the commercial sector. The commercial sector is primarily provided for its members, not for schools, not for clubs, not for galas and kind of events and competitions. And many of these pools wouldn't meet the requirements for swimming competitions as well. If we look at sports halls, it's quite clear to see here that the majority are provided through in the public sector, through local authorities and those sites on schools, many of which will be available for community use. And that, the sports club sector is relatively small and the commercial sector is relatively small in this field. If we look at grass pitches, this is an interesting one. So football is the largest participation sport, and there are other significant participation sports here. And what we can see again is that the public sector is dominant. Yeah, so over 2/3, well over 2/3 of grass pitches are provided by local authorities and education school sites. Yeah, so in the public sector. And that sports clubs are the next, and that, there isn't really a significant commercial presence in grass pitches. If we look at artificial grass pitches, things are a little bit different. So the majority of artificial grass pitches are still provided through state schools and local authority leisure centres, but there is more commercial activity here. Now, why is this? Because they're not interested in pitch sports on grass. And the answer is because of intensity of use. So an artificial grass pitch can accommodate intensive use, which means it can generate high levels of revenue. A grass pitch requires arguably more maintenance, but cannot sustain a large number of games a week before the surface is degraded and turns to mud or becomes difficult to play on and destroys the quality of the pitch. So it's difficult to generate revenue from grass pitches, and that's why the commercial sector is not interested in it, because you can't generate revenue. But through intensive use, you can generate revenue for artificial grass pitches, and that's why there is involvement. And this is primarily around football. So long carpet pile is 3G rubber crumb kind of football pitches, which is the Football Association's preferred surface. And what you can see is that, organisations like Goals, soccer centres are providing that because there is commercial opportunity to let those out. Okay, so that's the end of this screencast. There is a review task for this, and what I'd like you to do is review the slides that you've just looked at, and I want you to make some notes for yourself on what you've learned from this. And this is around 3 questions. So, which sector out of the commercial, public or voluntary do you think is most economically significant in terms of facility management? So in terms of revenue generated, which is the biggest sector? Is it private gyms? Is it public leisure centres? Is it voluntary sector provision? Okay. I want you to then review the evidence and think about which sector is most significant in terms of the number of people using its sports facilities, and list the evidence with figures to support this from the screencast. Right? And then finally, using information that I presented to you in the final slides of this screencast, I want you to think about which sector is most significant in terms of the number and range of facilities provided. And I think there are some clear answers to that based on what we've presented in this screencast. But my background could be slightly biased because my background is very much in local government, local council sport. And I do feel its role has been undervalued and underplayed by policymakers and by government in sport for the last, certainly for the last dozen years, and probably longer than that as well. Okay, so that's the end of this screencast. And in the next screencast, we're going to look at trends and issues in sports facility management.